Have you thought about how many different types of words we have nowadays to describe someone who's into or like Japan for one reason or another? Well, I'm confused and I feel like I need to break it down a bit. Because not only is it getting out of hand, do we even need them at all? Because no other country has so many different specific words for liking different part of that culture, right? And a weeb isn't the same as an otaku, but you can probably be both. But they're not the same as being a Japanophile, I think. And what about people who just like calligraphy or tea ceremonies? And when did the term WAPANESE go out of business? People used it all the time. So can you be some of them? None of them? Can you be all but not some of none of them? And when does yellow or Asian fever enter the game? In this video, I'm gonna focus on these 3 main culprits, and let's start with this one. I think most people who use it already knows it comes from the comic The Perry Bible Fellowship, which is a webcomic by a guy called Nicholas Gurwitch. It's actually really great and I'd recommend anyone to check his stuff out. But anyway, let's look at the panels where it originated. If we waste any more time on weeaboo, we'll be bankrupt by the end of the month. Did someone just say weeaboo? Cause I think I heard someone say weeaboo. Weeaboo! Weeaboo! But this is just a nonsense word, right? Made up by Nicholas in a random comic of his. It doesn't explain why it's used for, let's say, an anime nerd. Because I remember clearly when people used the term WAPANESE for people like that. So apparently the term WAPANESE was used at 4chan to such an extent that the moderators used some kind of filter to replace the word WAPANESE with the term weeaboo everywhere on the entire forum, which is hilarious. And I still don't know how they came to choose the word weeaboo specifically. It's even been added to the online racial slur database. So good luck if you want to get rid of it now. And then in the wake of that whole thing, the term WAPANESE just faded away, I guess. Now, both WAPANESE and weeb are supposed to be used for people who take their Japanese hobby way too seriously, to a point of cringe, or who are obnoxious and wannabe Japanese, and so on. But I feel like the term is kind of slipping away. It's used so broad nowadays that just mentioning something Japanese on the internet triggers people to say weeb right away. In my opinion, I think we should reserve this word for the real cringe monsters out there, if you know what I mean. If you visit the Wikipedia page for the word otaku, I mean, it's a huge page and it's really complicated, it's a lot to go through, so we're just taking on the essentials today. When I think of it, images like this pop into my head. And if we do a quick Google search, it's not that far from the truth, but we do get some new information. Otaku, Japanese. Otaku, or otaku, is a Japanese term for people with consuming interests, particularly in anime and manga. And that right there is the point of the otaku. It is a neutral term, but it's mostly associated with the manga and anime people because they are the biggest collectors, the biggest nerds, the hardest fans, and so on. Its contemporary use originated with Akio Nakamori's 1983 essay in the manga Burikko. And here's what Burikko looked like in the 80s. The definition of otaku subsequently became more complex and numerous classifications of otaku emerged. The 80s is 40 years ago now, so to get a modern Japanese take on it, let's check out a short clip from the awesome That Japanese Guy Yuta's video about otakus and hear what Japanese people actually think.
物事に特筆して詳しい人、フィギュアとかアニメとか。
僕は釣りが好きなので、釣りに関してはオタクって呼ばれてもおかしくはないかなとは思います。
ディズニーオタクなんか情報をすごい集めてディズニーのリゾートとか行くとテンションが上がってみたいな。
年に何回ぐらい
5回6回ぐらい。
確かに服とかよりももうなんかその好きなものっていうイメージ、お金のかけ方がそっちに行ってるから他は二の次っていうイメージあります。
そうですね、自分の周りでも割とオタクの友達が多いんですけど、みんな優しくていい人が多いんで、自分としてはいいイメージがありますね。
これはいいイメージがありますね。やっぱその物事に一個に集中できるっていうのはなんか僕はそのできないんで、それについては本当にすごいと思います。
自分はなんか偏見入るんですけど、悪いイメージもあって、
日本のことを知ってもらえるいい機会だと思うので、増えてほしいっていうか、増えても別にそんな不快感はないですね。
それ日本のアニメとかってすごい影響力あるし、それが好きでオタクになるんだろう。別に日本人の自分としてはなんかそれは嬉しいことなんじゃないかなと思います。
好きならいいんじゃないかなみたいな。いいと思います、増えても。
迷惑かけなければいいんじゃないかな。
楽しんでください。
Judging by this, it boils down to 3 categories. Either it's a regular nerd, a collector of some sort, or someone who's very fond of or very knowledgeable about a certain subject. However, the NRI, not that NRI, the Nomura Research Institute made 2 studies in 2004 and 5 about what sort of things otaku tend to favorize. The following are the top 7 main groups that were popular in Japan at the time. 350,000 people, manga otaku. About 280,000, idol and celebrity otaku. 250,000 people were considered traveling otakus. 190,000, computer game otaku. 160,000, video game otaku. 140,000 people were considered car otaku. And 110,000, anime otaku. There were 5 more categories where things like smartphones, sound and video equipment, fashion and training were also included, but I thought this was interesting enough. What really surprised me about this was that manga has this huge lead over all the other categories, while anime was the least popular. I feel that might be reversed in the West actually. Alright, so it's time to delve into what a Japanophile is. I honestly thought the term would be something really negative or much worse than Weeb, and it kind of is, but depending on what definitions you use. If you look at the Urban Dictionary, it says, one who is terribly obsessed with Japan and anything Japanese. He/she may even get sexual stimulation from anything remotely related to Japan or Japanese culture. Now, that's quite a description, isn't it? However, it does have a page on Wikipedia too, and it's really elaborate, and it has the complete opposite view from the Urban Dictionary. The appreciation and love for Japanese culture, people, and history. And it goes way back too. Here's a great example of a Japanophile from Sweden. No, not you, Karl Peter Thunberg from the 1700s. No, but seriously, this guy. Swedish-born bodybuilder and model Sebastian Björk turned Japanese citizen, now known as Tatsumasa Murasame, and working as an expert traditional Japanese gardener. But let's be honest here, there's no way this guy would call himself a Japanophile. Even with the good connotations from Wikipedia, it'll never not sound bad, right? We need to scrap this word, keep the definition, and then just invent a new one. Now for some stories of irregular kinds of people I've personally met in Japan, who I don't think count as any of the previously mentioned words. In my opinion, they're just people who kind of ended up in Japan a bit randomly. There was this Indian guy who lived in my share house for a while when I was studying Japanese in Tokyo. He was working for a gaming company there and he loved game developing, but like nothing else. He didn't want to learn Japanese either because he only used English at the office anyway, and all his other interests were in India. However, he had to wear that traditional Japanese salaryman suit. And if you don't know what a Japanese salaryman is, it's basically just a Japanese male office worker. But they all look the same and drink hard. You can find them like passed out all over the place, even in the middle of the street or in the subway. There's even a Facebook page for it. An American couple, I don't know if they were from Canada or the US, but they sat next to me and my friends at an izakaya and kind of joined in with our group when we were out drinking. It's a great place in Shibuya, by the way. Check it out if you're there. It says "Eat here" on the door, you can't miss it. Anyway, this guy and his wife had their honeymoon in Japan and kept talking about how much they loved Japan, Japanese culture, and how much they wished they lived there. You know the drill, right? And the guy would get angry and like debate me and my friends about it if we disagreed, which just kind of ruined the mood throughout the night. I call people like this wannabe expats. So there was this French guy in my Japanese class who was just unfriendly and really secretive. I don't want to shit on French people though. I've met good people from France too. But he never accepted any invites for trips in Japan, parties, or even school activities. He almost never talked to anyone. At the end, I still couldn't figure out one thing he actually liked about Japan, but he did stay for the better part of 6 or 7 months. He just looked displeased and pissed off all the time. I don't think he was an introvert either, because he actually performed really good at lessons. He could hold speeches and stuff like that, so I don't know, he just felt like the I have no idea why I'm here kind of guy. And lastly, the Danish guy. He was a dude who wanted to learn Japanese to use it in his work in Denmark somehow, but ultimately he didn't study enough and just ended up making trips, skipping lessons, mostly just went clubbing, slept around a lot, got a girlfriend and just went home. He was like, alright, time to study hard. You know what? F it, I'm just gonna have a blast. And then when I come home, I'm gonna... Actually, I have no idea. So let's talk about Asian fever, or yellow fever, or whatever fever you're into. F***ing, you know, just insert certain type of people fever. In our case, it's Japan. So people tend to think that a guy who goes to Japan mostly does it because Asian girl cute. As if that one simple shallow attribute was your entire main objective. Another thing might be that foreigners are supposed to be popular in Japan, or that Japanese girls are submissive, and here's my take on it. During my time in Japan, after having a Japanese girlfriend and going there back and forth a lot, it did get to me. You know, meeting and spending time with Japanese people in general, I noticed that they're very different, but in a very awesome and completely new way that I had never experienced before. And you want to hang out with them more and more, and you want to explore the country more and more. And after a while, it kind of feels like your second home and you get very attached to it. There are downsides and complications to it as well, don't get me wrong, but you don't want to go back to dating the kinds of people that you used to. You might later, but for me, for a long time, that's how I felt. And if you're single and you live in a new country, you don't have much of a dating choice anyway, you just have to date the people around you. And even if it's not a permanent stay though, if you have a strong connection to a certain place, it just feels like it makes more sense to get a partner from that place. If it turns out that way, ultimately it's gonna be up to the two of you as a couple to decide where you're going to live in the future. Because long distance relationships are really hard. When it comes to especially Japanese girls being shy and submissive, that's not really true. I think that's mostly a cultural misunderstanding. Rather than shy and submissive, they are careful and traditional, but they do have high standards too. You don't just get a Japanese girlfriend, like all the same rules still apply. You gotta bring your best game, you have to be a good, confident and interesting person. That should go without saying. And lastly, when it comes to the foreigners being really popular in Japan, maybe it's true to an extent, but only if you're interesting, because Japanese people are very curious and very polite. So you might feel like Mr. Popular, but stay humble, okay? So let's summarize everything and conclude. A person who's into Japanese things to a point of cringe or obsession is a weeb. If you're a serious collector, a gamer, or very knowledgeable about a certain hobby, then regardless of it being related to Japan or not, you're actually otaku. Japanophiles are, depending on the definition, either total freaking weirdos or just genuine fans of Japan and Japanese culture. Not confusing at all, right? If you're irregular, then there's no common word for you. And if someone is interested in a certain aspect of Japanese culture, say tea ceremonies, then there's no need to come up with a new word for that yet. And no matter what country or place you go to, it's okay to have the so-called fever as long as it's not purely driven by lust or selfishness. In my humble opinion though, while the word otaku seems very adjusted and kind of meant for Japanese people from the beginning, Japanophile just being kind of like a double-edged sword, and with WAPANESE fading away, I think we should keep Weeb for now because it has a cool story. All the other ones seem kind of excessive, but that's pretty much all I have for now. So yeah, smash like, subscribe, see you next time.